Two of my absolute favorites, Jonathan Jones and Aditi Kinkhabwala, joining us now on HQ. All right, let's talk about these coaches. The first head coaching opening we saw was during the season, as I just mentioned, with the Jets firing Robert Saleh after week 5. We don't know if Aaron Rodgers is going to be back or not. So, JJ, who makes sense as the Jets' next head coach?
Well, they are interviewing a lot of people. I have the list pulled up right here. Obviously, they've already interviewed Ron Rivera and Rex Ryan. They're going to have Rex Ryan in tomorrow. They have interviewed Mike Vrabel, and they have guys like Joe Brady, Arthur Smith, Vance Joseph, Aaron Glenn, Brian Flores, and Josh McCown all on their list. One guy who's not on the list, Ben Johnson, the Lions offensive coordinator, one of the hottest candidates out there. And look, I think the Jets understand that if they put in for him, that they would probably be turned down. So they're going to spare themselves that embarrassment, if one considers that to be embarrassing. And I have been reporting that they will ultimately target experience at either or both of the head coach and GM position. So Woody Johnson usually has hired first-timers in his quarter century of ownership there with the Jets. I don't think that's going to be the case this time. So if he hires a first-timer at head coach, I don't think that it will be a first-timer at GM, but also the timing is going to be very unique. Odds are that they will be employing a general manager first, who then would be involved in the search process, sort of at the end there for the head coach, but Woody Johnson, of course, making the final call.
And Jonathan, I can tell you this, that several of those candidates for the coaching position know that they have some pretty key questions for ownership within whatever their interviews are. We know that there were quite a few surprises in the decision-making that ownership made, sort of in a vacuum this season. And so the structure will be incredibly important to at least several of these candidates who I've spoken to. And when you talk about the GM head coach relationship, that can't be an arranged marriage. So don't be surprised if there's input on either end on who the GM can work with and who the head coach can work with.
Real quick, JJ, what's the latest when it comes to Rodgers? Do you think he's going to be back? I know he wants to take some time to think about it. What's your initial take on it?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it may not be his call, or it may also be his call. When the general manager and head coach ultimately are decided upon, they're going to have control and say over the roster. I've been told there's been no edicts from Woody Johnson in these interviews to anyone about whether Rodgers should stay or go. I would just say that if it's your first crack at being a general manager or a head coach, do you really want the declining Aaron Rodgers, all of the off-the-field baggage that comes with Aaron Rodgers? Is that what you want in your first year with the New York Jets, with the New York media, with all of those things? I'm not entirely sure. I don't believe he will be back next year, but make no mistake, no final decisions have yet been made.
Looking at the Patriots now, so they moved on from Jerod Mayo basically an hour after they won the game on Sunday. Robert Kraft came out. He said he chose Mayo to succeed Bill Belichick about 5 years ago, but just came out and apologized, saying he was taking the blame, that he believes that firing him was the best option to return this team to championship contention. JJ, are you surprised with Kraft's comments?
I'm not surprised because he has to take ownership, because this was the head coach in waiting. He never had a coaching search. He and Jonathan Kraft had determined after the 2022 season, when there were teams that were wanting to inquire about Jerod Mayo, at the time an assistant position coach with the team, about maybe he could be the head coach of their team. Robert Kraft said, hold on, wait, we're going to rework his contract. We're going to make him the coach in waiting, that when we part ways or when Bill Belichick retires, we're going with Jerod Mayo. That happened, and look, he didn't have long enough to implement his plan or vision, if you believe in his plan or vision. And obviously, over the last month or so, Robert Kraft has tried to believe in that vision. He wasn't liking what he was hearing, certainly wasn't liking what he was seeing out there on the football field. And so he makes the move from Jerod Mayo. Don't, of course, be surprised if he moves from one Patriots great linebacker to another. Mike Vrabel's going to be a hot name here in New England.
A little Vrabel action. We've been hearing that name tossed around quite a bit. Now, Aditi, you had a front row seat to the Patriots game, just on the sidelines this past weekend with the team. What was the vibe you were feeling out there?
You know, it was terrible because you're watching Jerod Mayo, and even going back to our production meeting, you sort of felt like it was dead man walking, as if he was resigned to this. But let's go back to what Mr. Kraft said. Jerod Mayo was not set up to succeed here. He had only 5 years experience as an assistant coach. His playing career, his assistant coach career, it was all in New England. There was not a big network. That hampered him when it came time to getting a coaching staff, to finding good assistants. Now, the offensive staff actually deserves a ton of credit for what it was able to do with Drake May, despite having no talent on that side of the ball outside of maybe Hunter Henry to support that young quarterback. But it was Elliott Wolf who had to help Jerod Mayo find a lot of those offensive coaches. On the defensive side of the ball, well, we saw the huge dip that the Patriots took. And the other piece with that staff is that Jerod Mayo, because he was so inexperienced, really needed an old head on that staff. A guy like Leslie Frazier, who Mike McDonald brought in, someone that had handled the game day decision making, somebody that had sat in that seat, somebody who could guide Mayo. He didn't have anybody like that on his staff. There were missteps after missteps in terms of using the media and creating your own media narrative. There was a lot of questions. There were a lot of questions, about game day decision making. But the key here, and JJ alluded to this, he's right, the Patriots were inclined to give Mayo a little bit more time from what I was told. The specter of Dan Campbell and the patience that the Lions had with Dan Campbell is always out there. But Mike Vrabel and Mike Vrabel's dance with the Jets really pushed the Patriots' hand a little bit here. We don't think that Bob Kraft, right? Correct me if I'm wrong here. We don't think Bob Kraft wanted to see Mike Vrabel spend the next 20 years with a division mate, with the Jets. And so this was very wily of how this all went down, what was very public here. And the Patriots did feel that they didn't want to fall out of the Mike Vrabel sweepstakes. They wanted to have an opportunity to actually go after, to talk to a few people, as opposed to like we saw last year. And, you know, you heard Mr. Kraft say it, that he didn't give, that Jerod Mayo didn't have as much experience, and therefore he didn't necessarily set him up to succeed. It is definitely a very tough position. I felt very bad watching Mayo on the sideline. He couldn't enjoy the way that his players were fighting, especially Joe Milton, who went out there and secured that win. And it's just a bummer. It's a bummer for sure.
It is. Going back to the Vrabel situation, too, it's like you break up with an ex, and then you see that ex go and flirt with someone that you don't really like, and you're like, wait, come back here. Let's have a little chat about this. We're going to see how that goes. All right, let's talk about the Jags now. Moving on from Doug Pederson, but it's Trent Baalke who's staying. So, Aditi, how is that going to work with a new head coach coming in? How's it going to play out?
I mean, we'll see. Look, Trent Baalke's reputation, the way that coaches feel about working with him is pretty well known at this point. That is part of what's behind, and I know JJ reported this first thing this morning. That's part of why Shad Khan said that the new head coach would report to him and not, in fact, to the general manager. But I will say this, my phone has blown up all day with people in front offices who are astounded that Trent Baalke lives to see another day. He has had 38 draft picks in his 4 years as the GM. Only 9 of them have become starters. And P.S., 6 of those 38 draft picks were first rounders. When he talked earlier, we heard him saying that the product on the field, the production on the field just wasn't good enough. Well, Baalke's record is 25-43. So this is indeed very, very interesting. The Jaguars have overpaid for a lot of players. They committed $400 million in guaranteed money in this offseason. That, of course, is under Baalke's purview to players. They have quite a few aging players who have not produced. They only have an average amount of cap space, and yet Baalke will get another chance with the number 5 overall pick, and somehow there's this narrative that there's this great roster that's going to turn over really quickly. JJ, I'm not so sure that that's really true.
Yeah, JJ, when you look at this whole situation, you know, you got to find a guy who can figure out Trevor Lawrence and get success with him. So who's the head coach that can come in and save this ship?
Yeah, it'll be fascinating, right? And Aditi hit on so many of the key stats and figures and really kind of digging even deeper than just, hey, winnable AFC South, sure. Hey, Trevor Lawrence, yeah, okay, great. Sparkling new facilities, right? Brick and mortar is what Shad Khan was referring to earlier today. But it's not just that, right? There is more than that. But obviously, anytime that you have a quarterback, you are going to want to make sure that you are getting the most out of him, like what we saw those seasons ago when they went to the playoffs with Doug Pederson. And let's not forget Jim Bob Cooter was on that staff as well and won that playoff game. You know, look, the success of the guys like Dan Campbell and Dan Quinn and, of course, Mike Tomlin every single year and many, many other of these CEO-type head coaches or leader of men coaches, that phrase. I don't think that you absolutely have to get an offensive coach, frankly, anywhere. I think that there are talented coaches on both sides of the football and special teams coordinators as well, though we're not really talking about them as candidates this cycle. I would say, of course, though, when you're looking around at some names, Ben Johnson is going to be a name. You're going to probably hear Aaron Glenn on defense. You're going to hear Joe Brady and the work that he's been able to do there in Buffalo. And so those are a couple of key names. I'd keep an eye potentially on a Matt Nagy, someone who could work with a veteran general manager who has been around the block with a young quarterback in Mitchell Trubisky. Those are just a few names that you could see as Jacksonville begins their search. And I want to emphasize begins because Shad Khan was not taking any inquiries over the past couple weeks. He was letting the football people do their football thing, which a lot of people do respect. But that also means that they are behind just a little bit. They certainly are not as far along their process as, let's say, the Jets are. And so because of that, they're going to have to play a little bit of catch up right now.
Letting the football people do their football thing. The quote from David. I love it. All right, guys, don't go anywhere. We have so much more to talk about after this quick break. We're going to look ahead at some of the NFL head coaches who survived on this Monday, up to this point, at least. So JJ and Aditi will be back with us with much more to discuss on this Monday afternoon. Back on HQ, the Raiders dealing with the most losses in a season since 2014. Started 2-12 before going 2-1 in the final 3 games. So that dropped from a number 2 to a number 6 overall pick in the NFL draft. One bright spot, Brock Bowers, most receptions by a rookie in NFL history, even with all the quarterback questions and issues there. Now, questions surrounding the organization, that's for sure. You look at the longest active droughts without a playoff win. You see the Raiders there, 22 seasons. Their last win coming in 2002. So does head coach Antonio Pierce deserve to be safe? First full season as the head coach. It seems like he is safe. Here's what he had to say.
I'll ask you again, do you have any clarity on what's happening next year about your job status?
I haven't been told anything different.
Do you want to get that cleared up ASAP, or do you?
It's only coming from the outside. It's not inside the building, so to me, there's nothing to clean up until I hear it from inside the building.
Jonathan Jones and Aditi Kinkhabwala back with us on HQ, looking at some of these coaches now who might have escaped the axe. We just saw Raiders head coach Antonio Pierce saying he hasn't heard anything different other than that he's coming back for 2025. JJ, he's saying all of that talk is coming from the outside, not the inside. Is that what you believe?
It's a good question. Good way to phrase that, right? And, you know, Aditi has heard this plenty from head coaches before, and we've all heard this where they are saying, yeah, I haven't heard from the owner, so I'm going to work and going to continue to operate as though I'm still employed because I am. That happens all the time. That's what you should do. But he also, in that press conference, noted that he still has a meeting with Mark Davis and Tom Telesco. And then he will then determine if he remains on the rest of his staff, right? Patrick Graham, the defensive coordinator, his contract is expiring. And there's other decisions that will certainly have to be made after he made some changes to offensive coordinator, offensive line, and the quarterback's coach there midway through the season. It has been a tough year for Antonio Pierce. This is not building upon that incredible run that they had when he was interim and giving a lot of life to the team. Obviously, there was that messy divorce with Devontae Adams, of course. And look, he knows and understands that he's going to have to be better this upcoming season. He knows and understands he's going to have a quarterback, and even sort of noted that he made the wrong decision at quarterback to start the year, going with Gardner Minshew instead of Aiden O'Connell. So I would not say and sign in blood or etch in stone that Antonio Pierce is back in 2025 with the Las Vegas Raiders, but I would say that over the weekend there was a lot more optimism than maybe I was anticipating coming out of Vegas that Pierce would be back. And as long as this keeps rolling on, one has to assume that because he continues to work as the head coach, he's the head coach.
JJ, I was just talking to a member of that staff, actually, who said that inside the building, it certainly seems that everything is okay and that they are indeed back. And that is actually the sense that the staff and the players inside the building had the last few weeks. Mark Davis last week was in the postgame locker room screaming Raiders and certainly seemed on board. There was no coldness there. You're right that there have been some growing pains this year. Look, Antonio Pierce actually just a few weeks ago told us that that quarterback decision was because they felt the first 4 weeks Gardner Minshew was a better matchup and that they were then going to reassess, okay, because that training camp battle had been so tight, is this what we should do? Then, of course, injury sort of push that forward. But they are happy with what they've seen out of Aiden O'Connell. They are very, very happy with how much better and how much more efficient the offense got when they made the change from Luke Getsy to Scott Turner. Scott Turner, of course, was the interim offensive coordinator. You can expect him to become the full-time offensive coordinator now. You're right that there will likely be some changes on that defensive staff, and Patrick Graham was someone that Antonio Pierce had inherited. But Antonio Pierce had some growing pains this year, too. He was unabashedly himself when he was the interim coach. Then when he officially got the job, there was a little bit of a conflict. He would be himself and he would talk to players in a way that maybe other head coaches don't. But then he also tried to dial it back and try to be what he thought a head coach was. And then he was very honest with our crew about this. He finally realized, you know what, I just have to be me. And that's that. And his players absolutely responded to him. I talked about this with Max Crosby just a few weeks ago, and he said, look, I put my name on this. I am still putting my name on this. I think that AP is the guy to lead us, and we all talk about the Lions and how sometimes it just takes patience. And right now, JJ, Jenny, you both know this. There are a lot of teams that are looking at Dan Campbell, who had some really, really rough early go at it, whose team couldn't seem to win those close games until it finally did win a close game and started rattling off those wins. We remember that Sheila Ford-Hamp came out and gave Dan a very, very public vote of confidence. In fact, I was there that week for that, and look at where they are now. So JJ is right. Expect some staff changes. That offensive staff is shorthanded. I don't expect Norv Turner to come back and help his son. Scott had pulled him out of retirement for a few weeks because they were shorthanded. I do expect Scott Turner to be the official full-time offensive coordinator. The offense took a lot of steps. They'll fill out that staff. They'll probably do a lot more with that defensive staff. But the players respond to Antonio Pierce. And so the feeling there is that this is about patience, not that there's a misguided selection. Not that there was a misguided selection in installing Antonio Pierce.
AP still staying strong there. I think what you all just said is just keep showing up at work until they tell you not to show up anymore. That's what we do every day.
That's what I do, right?
Yeah, I'll just keep coming here until they're like, you're done. Okay, the Giants we're going to go to next. They're retaining Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen. Not long ago, they were putting all their eggs into one basket, and that was Daniel Jones, just right there. Now, you have to think they're going to draft a quarterback. So, Aditi, what do you think that's going to look like under these guys?
There's not necessarily a great quarterback available, and you have to be right on that. So I'll sit here and say that from what I was told in having quite a few conversations about this, I don't think that there was ever any question that Joe would be back. There was some question about Brian Daboll. The two of them obviously have known each other for quite a while. Mr. Mara, John Mara, the Giants owner, is not a hair trigger sort of person. He's also just a very, very nice man. I was talking to a member of the organization earlier today who said that he may just be too nice to do anything right now. So what do you do with new life? That's the question here. JJ can probably tell you better about their draft plans. I will say that I believe in that building while there was not surprise about Joe, there was maybe a little bit of surprise about Daboll, but now the two of them get to work together here and see what the best move going forward is.
JJ, what's your take?
Sorry. Yeah, I was just marveling at Brian Wilson's
list.
Mock draft. He does such an amazing job, right? Look, when it comes to the draft, they're picking number 3, and we obviously are going to wait and see how these quarterbacks are going to wind up shaking out, right? We know it's Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. If they go 1-2 in this draft, well, I'm sorry, Giants, there's no one there left for you because the Titans and the Browns gobbled them up. So we'll see. We also know this is going to be a weak free agency class, right? Let's go ahead and assume that Sam Darnold returns to the Minnesota Vikings, whether that's the franchise tag or a long-term deal. Let's go ahead and assume that Russell Wilson returns to the Pittsburgh Steelers. I know that's not so great of a free agent, perhaps, as it would have been around Thanksgiving, but let's just go ahead and say that. Jameis Winston, Trey Lance, I mean, it's, as we can see here, this is not a very strong group. If you're talking about a New York Giants team that parted with Daniel Jones because they needed to be better, one could argue that the available guys to them next year will be worse than Daniel Jones. So they're going to have to get something figured out because, of course, they don't get an extra runway. Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen are not getting a contract extension. They get 2025 to prove it. And hopefully they make the decisions, and I believe that they will make the decisions that will be best for the Giants organization, not what's best for them to retain their jobs. Because if I know either of these two men, it is certainly that as long as we win, that's what's best for the team, and that's what will keep us in this position. So it'll be fascinating to watch who Brian Daboll ultimately targets. We know that he is one of the best molders of quarterbacks, and certainly Josh Allen, perhaps the NFL MVP this season with Joe Brady. He would be able to say that probably better than anyone else out there. Not a surprise, of course, that Joe Schoen is remaining, though, because John Mara, as we all saw on HBO Hard Knocks, was involved in every single decision, and as embarrassing, as gut-wrenching as some of those decisions were, as perhaps wrong as some of those decisions were. To have fired Joe Schoen this week would have been John Mara having to fire himself because he agreed with and signed off on so many of these decisions, and we all know that owners don't like to fire themselves.
No, they don't. That's very true. All right, real quick on Deshaun Watson, I just want to get the news out there. Suffered a setback in recovering from his Achilles injury. JJ, they're saying it's too early to tell his status from 2025. What are you hearing about that?
Well, it was already too early to determine his status for 2025 because, his recovery timeline and his history of unfortunate injuries has kind of been all over the place, has never really followed what the docs may initially say for whatever reason. And so because of that, they weren't sure if he would be ready for week 1. They had assumed that he wouldn't be able to pass a physical until late in the summer. We don't know what kind of setback this was, but obviously significant enough with the type of injury to the Achilles for October surgery that they are pushing out that timeline even further. So does that mean he's going to miss all of training camp? We certainly will have to wait to see. But this doesn't change what the Browns have to do. They've had to go out and get a quarterback in some way because of Watson's play, not just his injury, but you combine the two, of course you have to get another quarterback. So will it be someone in the draft? Will it be someone in free agency? I nominate both for the Cleveland Browns. They certainly will be getting someone out there in free agency, and then sitting at number 2, maybe moving to 1. Can't wait for this spring. They will probably have to get a quarterback in the draft.
Jenny, I'll just say this really quickly. No matter what they do at the quarterback position, they need to figure out their offensive staff. This past year was an absolute disaster. Play calling duties were taken away from Kevin Stefanski, given to Ken Dorsey, who has since been fired, and who, oh, by the way, last year was deemed not a good enough offensive coordinator for the Buffalo Bills. They ripped up the entire staff a year ago, a staff that had led 5 different starting quarterbacks to the playoffs. So before you even talk about what they're doing at the position, they need to figure out who's growing and developing and leading that position.
Very important roles there. JJ Aditi with the latest in the NFL. Appreciate you both so much here on HQ. We have 2 playoff games on Saturday, 3 on Sunday, and 1 on Monday night. You'll catch all the action on CBS Sports HQ. We are your home For the NFL and, of course, CBS, we'll have 2 games next weekend. The Chargers and the Texans, Saturday, January 11th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern, and Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern, it's the Broncos and the Bills. Those will also be streaming on Paramount+.